Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Metal Slug 3 for a lot of different systems that are being displayed on the screen right now, but what you're seeing is the Neo Geo version. This is an arcade-style run-and-gun shooter by SNK that was originally released for arcades in 2000 and later saw release on other systems, the first of those being the Neo Geo version that you're seeing here, and went on to be very well received when it was released in the arcades, but when it came to home consoles, things get a bit more mixed, mostly with regard to the value proposition of an old-school arcade-style run-and-gun shooter that was being released for a pretty high price for what it is on the home console versions. Later ports and re-releases would of course be priced lower, but even then you're still talking about a bit of a value proposition issue for home consoles when you've got a lot of other games on the market at that point. You gotta remember that the original release was in 2000, and with the exception of the Neo Geo, it was showing up on home consoles in 2003 and later, so it was much past its prime at that point. And it was kind of odd to be charging, say, $40 or more for a home console version of a rather short arcade game. But here's the thing, I'm looking at this as a sequel to Metal Slug X, not so much Metal Slug 2, because this followed up Metal Slug X, which of course was the remake of Metal Slug 2. If you have not seen my reviews of the original Metal Slug and Metal Slug 2 along with Metal Slug X, because I put Metal Slug 2 and Metal Slug X in the same video, then I very highly recommend you watch those first, because I'm not going to cover stuff I went over in those reviews. This is where I'll have an annotation up on the screen that you can click on to watch my Metal Slug 2 and Metal Slug X review, because again, they're combined. And if you haven't seen the original Metal Slug review, then that's also linked in the Metal Slug 2 and Metal Slug X review. So you really do have to see where the series came from before this to understand Metal Slug 3. With that said, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly what they did. Well, as far as presentation goes, there's really not much to say compared to the previous two Metal Slug games. It still has absolutely amazing pixel art that holds up extremely well to this day. The environments are absolutely packed with detail, the character sprites themselves are packed with detail, the animations are exceptionally smooth and fluid, and there's a ton of charm in the visuals to where everything is just kind of ridiculous and it has a good sense of humor about it, meaning there's always something to be smiling at from a visual standpoint. The sound design is similarly well done. You've got a pretty strong Metal Slug sounding soundtrack that is a bunch of upbeat arcade game style music that fits it extremely well, and even though you're not going to really be listening to it outside of the confines of the game, it's very easily recognizable as Metal Slug music. The sound effects are pretty punchy and definitely sound like they're straight out of an arcade game and fit it extremely well. And then the voice acting consists of a bunch of screaming and yelling that you hear from where you're shooting the enemies and they're shooting back at you. And of course the narrator, which is basically copy-pasted from Metal Slug X. And it's glorious. No, seriously, the narrator is so ridiculously cheesy and ridiculous with the various pronunciations of things that you can't help but burst out laughing or at least giggle at certain things. It all gives the game a metric ton of charm, and it really does help it out quite a bit in the long run, because this game really does stand the test of time in its presentation department. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set a few years after the events of Metal Slug 2 or Metal Slug X, depending on which version you played. And once again you take on the role of either Marco, Tarma, Eri, or Fio, and you're going up against the rebel forces once again. Man, the bad guys just do not learn their lesson after getting their asses kicked so many times, do they? Anyway, that's pretty much all you need to know about it, because there's really not much plot to this game. It's just you are a hero and you're going to kill all the bad guys and save the world again. They do throw in a plot twist at the end of the game that you pretty much see coming from a mile away, but it does at least mean that the last level is a pretty interesting level, and it's actually rather lengthy. So it does pull that cliche, "Oh, you thought it was over, think again," kind of thing, which is of course an incredibly well used cliche, but in Metal Slug it actually works okay because this is the first entry in the series that does that. So it's something that ends up being, despite a cliche, actually fairly fresh for the series. The thing is, you don't really give too much of a crap about the story in Metal Slug because it's really just backdrop for what you're actually doing in the game, which is running and shooting stuff. I've already discussed the core gameplay of Metal Slug to death in my previous two reviews of the prior Metal Slug games, so I'm not going to go over the basics here again, and instead I'm going to talk about what Metal Slug 3 brings to the table, which is quite a bit more content. In addition to the expected new levels and expected new enemy types, there's also some slight redesigns. For example, mummies aren't in this particular Metal Slug game, but zombies are. They basically function exactly the same as the mummies, except that you can use a extremely powerful vomiting attack that spews blood all over the entire screen and ends up just kind of annihilating everything. There's several new vehicles, including a helicopter, and there's even a couple of levels where you're either on a jetpack, unless you've actually managed to get a flying vehicle, or you end up donning a scuba set and going underwater and getting a different way of launching your grenades than simply throwing them at things. And it does shake up the gameplay enough to make things interesting if you've played the previous two Metal Slug games. Because that really strong core gameplay that we know and love from the previous two Metal Slug games is still there. It's just that they did exactly what you would expect from a sequel. They expanded upon it, added a bunch of new content that fits in really well with what's going on, and actually they made the game quite a bit more difficult than even Metal Slug X. They were just absolutely unrelenting in their quest for quarters, it seems, and thus you end up finding that the gameplay can be really bullshit a lot of the time. Still doable, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of instances where you're like, oh, come on, game, you're just kind of going all out just to get quarters here. And that's a lot more obvious than the previous two Metal Slug games, because the Metal Slug games before this were definitely hard, but if you knew what you were doing, you could generally get through without too much difficulty. Unless, of course, you're like me, in which case you're terrible at Metal Slug and you just end up failing miserably no matter what you do as far as the difficulty is concerned. So when I went into Metal Slug 3, it was just constantly demolishing me, especially compared to the previous three games. Although if you want something that's more difficult than the previous Metal Slug games, then you'll feel right at home here. And really, that's what's going to ultimately make or break it for you, because the foundation is there. It's an extremely strong run-and-gun arcade shoot-'em-up. The problem is that despite it being more content than the previous games, it's also quite a bit more difficult. And if you thought the Metal Slug games were too hard to begin with, then you're going to think that Metal Slug 3 is ridiculous. The thing is, you have to keep in mind two things. First off, Metal Slug 3 is the third game in the series. They keep ramping up the difficulty to make more money by getting you to spend more quarters to get more continues. But at the same time, they're also having to update this for the established fans of the series, and thus they need to make it more and more difficult because that's just something you do with these kind of games in order to keep the players interested. And as a result, unlike the previous games in the series where I would be more willing to recommend them to a more general audience, in the case of Metal Slug 3, I can really only recommend it to fans of the genre or especially fans of the series. As far as being a sequel to the previous Metal Slug games, they've definitely done what you would expect of them. They've made it more, and they've improved it and made it more difficult. And on those merits, it's a good sequel. The problem is that a sequel like this is not really something a general audience is going to be able to wrap their head around unless they've played the previous games and know what to expect difficulty-wise. But if you know what you're getting yourself into and you're willing to put up with a lot of frankly artificial difficulty, then you're going to find an extremely solid run-and-gun shooter here. In some ways a step up over Metal Slug X, but otherwise at the very least on the same level of quality. I will have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up on Steam if you're interested. Thanks for watching.